Alrighty, boys and girls, welcome back. We are finally continuing our episodic series on American history. We have finally gotten to our World War II episode. I've decided to keep it all together, so strap in. It's gonna be a long one. Now, I know I say this for basically every episode, but we're looking at things fairly topically. Big overview. I could have a whole channel on World War II. I could have a whole channel just on the American involvement in World War II. We're not going to get too much into the nitty gritty. There's going to be large parts of it that we don't talk about, and I apologize if I don't talk about your favorite part of the conflict. We will get there. We're going to go back. We're going to do vignettes. We're going to get into the little niche subjects. We will get there. Today, however, is not that day. Broad overviews for today. Um, Also, pardon my little leave of absence if you didn't watch the previous video on EDCs. Work has been very busy. It has been picking up immensely, which is really good. However, it doesn't leave me a lot of time for you folks, so I apologize for my hiatus. Anyways, let's get into it. So, Poland falls and the war begins. That's basically where we ended last time. Britain and France said to Germany, hey, look, if you try to take any more land, we're going to declare war. If you do anything with Poland, we're going to declare war. Well, the Germans walk into Poland and the Allies declare war. From one side, the Germans, very shortly thereafter, the Soviets will come from the other side. Poland falls fairly quickly. Um, However, the first Nazis to die in World War II die in Poland, and they die at the hands of mailmen. So I haven't linked here. I understand you can't click on it here. It's just for me to remember to hopefully put it in the description below. It's a Fat Electrician video, who, if you're not new here, you know how much I love him. Um, it's a Fat Electrician video on a group of Polish mailmen who took up arms. They honestly they stuck it to the Germans pretty hard for a bunch of guys that did not have to fight. They had no obligation to fight. They're not in the military, but they stuck it to the Germans. It's a really cool video. I recommend it. Go ahead and watch it. So, as we're starting out, who's fighting who? The Allied powers, like I said, largely France and Britain at the beginning, and the Axis powers are Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, at least for a little while. You know, Italy does their classic World War thing, and they switch sides. But this is where we are at the outbreak of the war as Poland falls. Now, I have a slide here on the German military structure, basically because when I was teaching this to my high school students, they had a bunch of questions about what these different words meant. They had heard them before from, what Band of Brothers or a movie or Call of Duty or whatever the case may be. They had heard the words before, but they didn't know what they meant. So I put this in there for them, and I wasn't going to take it out for the YouTube video. Why remove uh, um, info. So, the Wehrmacht, it's the regular German army. They are not necessarily Nazis. They're not necessarily part of the Nazi Party. These guys are regular soldiers. A lot of them drafted, especially towards the end of the war. Almost all of them were drafted at the end. Um, Regular army, the Wehrmacht, which will after the war will turn into the Bundeswehr. That's still what the German military is called today. The Luftwaffe, Air Force. Um, Mechanized division, tank divisions, armored cars, our panzer divisions. What I didn't put on here was Fallschirmjägers. Fallschirmjägers are paratroopers. The SS. Everybody knows that. It's in every World War II movie. The SS stands for Schutzstaffel. Basically, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. They're not part of the regular army. And they are broken down even further. So the General SS, basically in charge of security, general policing. They're like Hitler's top guys. The Waffen SS are the combat units. The Death's Head units. Totenkampfverband. Sorry, probably terrible pronunciation. Um, those guys were responsible for running the concentration camps. The Gestapo is like the secret police. They were seeking out enemies of the state. So, have you seen Inglorious Bastards? Christoph Waltz's character in that is part of the Gestapo. And then there's the Einsatzgruppen. And those units were their sole reason for existing were executing enemies of the state. So gypsies, Jews, homosexuals, cripples, the the whole lot. Um, they were they were the initial. Well, we'll get there. I'm not gonna get too ahead of myself. Anyways, I understand it's more nuanced than this. I understand it's more complicated and all of those things. But like I said, big broad overview today. So don't burn me up too much in the comments. The fall of France. After World War One, France is really mad at Germany, and um, they're fairly sure that Germany's going to do that again. So they build this giant set of defenses, basically this big defensive line uh, on their border, and the best defenses are on their border with Germany itself. And it extends a little bit farther than that, but the places that aren't the German border aren't fortified very well. And the Allies know this, and they know that Hitler's coming to France. So there's like basically two options. Either the Germans are going to go through Belgium's countryside, which is fairly flat, especially compared to the mountains of Luxembourg, and figuring that they're going to take the easy way in, like, oh, this is how they're going to get their tanks and stuff through here. Um, they all deploy to uh, the Belgian border. They deploy to Belgium, and the Germans simply go the other way. And by the time that the Allies figured out that the Germans went through Luxembourg, they were already behind the Allied troops. So there was no way for them to fall back and defend major cities like Paris. And once the Germans were behind the Allied troops, France falls in a matter of weeks, unfortunately. Here we have a map of what's going on. So, like, the thick, non-dotted line is obviously some very strong fortifications, and everywhere else is dotted. That's kind of how they knew that Germany was going to go through either Luxembourg or Belgium. So uh, they bet on the wrong horse there. Anyways, the U.S. during this initial invasion of Poland and invasion of France, we're still claiming neutrality. Uh, Not big fans of getting involved in European conflicts. That is, you know, very easily shown in World War One, where we stay out of it almost the whole time um, until the Lusitania and then the Zimmerman telegram and stuff. Um, but we're not strictly neutral. If we were really neutral, we'd sell guns to both sides. But we didn't. So, spring of 1940, Britain is asking the U.S. for some basically obsolete American destroyers. Sell us some of your old stuff, they're saying, and it'll be easier to defend uh, the main island of Britain to, the main, the UK as a whole, the islands of the UK, from a German invasion. And the U.S. is like, all right, however, if we're going to give you these ships, we get to build military bases in your territories. Newfoundland, Bermuda, a couple places in the Caribbean. And conveniently, this is known as the Destroyers for Bases deal. Um, the U.S. is also going to provide a whole pile of weapons and ammo to the British. They're going to drop it into partisans in France, the Soviets, uh, everywhere. We are going to give guns to everywhere. Thompson submachine guns and 1911 pistols are going to be in the hands of almost every single allied nation. China, all of them. Um, so they're everywhere. we are the Lend-Lease program is in full effect very early on, and everybody's getting some of it. And why are we doing this? Like, if we're claiming neutrality, why are we selling guns to one side? Basically, the idea was we need to provide the Allied powers with the water to put out this fire so it doesn't spread to us. That was kind of the line of thinking that was going on. One of the first huge battles of World War II is the Battle of Britain in 1940. Hitler wants to invade those islands. Obviously, Britain knew it. That's why they wanted those destroyers. And the biggest challenge of getting to Britain is crossing the English Channel. Um, and not just because crossing bodies of water is annoying as a military. The UK's Air Force, the Royal Air Force, arguably the best in the world at the time. There are some badass dudes, very well trained, very competent, and absolutely air superiority. And they were sinking German transport ships like it was their job, because it was. Um, so, in order to cross the English Channel, Hitler knows he has to destroy the RAF before he can even think about it. The Luftwaffe fights the RAF, and a German pilot accidentally bombs London. And the Brits, spoiler alert, not happy. So they go in and they bomb Berlin. This makes Hitler not happy. So he orders his pilots to stop attacking military targets and focus on simply bombing London. Only civilian targets. Um, Basically, he wanted to scare the British into surrendering. And what Hitler doesn't know is the Brits have this thing called radar. And that is how the RAF, along with their, quite frankly, superb training, um, that's how they keep messing up the Luftwaffe so bad, because they can see them coming way before the Luftwaffe has any idea that what's going on. RAF pilots are already in the air to intercept them. So after the Luftwaffe takes a severe beating, they give up. Britain is safe from invasion, basically for the remainder of the war. Now, another video I have here, shocker, it's a Fat Electrician video. A Royal Air Force pilot, he gets the nickname of Star Fox. Um, Super great video. Kind of goes into this a little bit more, and what a badass guy he was. So just shout out there. The Soviets become an ally, which is weird because we were just mad at them for invading Poland. Anyways, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler screws over his friends. He violates the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invades the USSR. He starts Operation Barbarossa. Um, Formerly independent nations, you know, basically nations that were quasi-independent prior to the forming of the Soviet Union, back when Russia was just Russia. Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, a couple other spots. They're the Germans tell them that they are invading, and they get a warning ahead of time, and they tell them to execute their Jewish populations, along with a couple others like gypsies, cripples, homosexuals, all the people that the Nazis hate. Um, and they said, listen, if you do this, when Germany obviously super quickly conquers the Soviet Union, um, you'll be given your independence once the Germans are in charge, basically. Spoiler alert, the Nazis were lying. And a whole pile of Jews get murdered as a result. Now, by becoming enemies with the Nazis, the Soviets de facto become a part of the Allies. Kind of like another part of World War II that we're not going to get into. Kind of like how Finland during the Winter War and the Continuation War are enemies with the Soviets, so they're de facto Axis powers, even though they're really not. They don't have almost no connection to Germany. They're just fighting the Soviets because the Soviets are dicks. Anyways, the Soviets become de facto part of the Allies. They start getting a bunch of lend-lease guns and ammo and all kinds of stuff. Um, and they open up the Germans open up a second front basically on themselves. But on Germany's eastern front, it's going to be the Soviets fighting them for the most part over there. Japan becomes a problem. Um, Late 30s, Japan is dependent on U.S. for a whole pile of stuff. Oil, shocker. Steel, iron, raw material, a whole bunch of things. Um, and as we talked about in our previous video, Japan has been invading like everywhere in Asia, and the U.S. is like, hey, stop being a dick, or we're gonna stop selling you stuff. And Japan is like, up yours. So the U.S. stops selling them stuff. And in response, Japan goes and bombs a whole bunch of places, and we'll get there in a second. But in terms of, I almost said mainland U.S., um, it's not, but it's much closer to home than the other places. They bomb the American military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7th, 1941. It's a surprise attack. Luckily, most of the U.S. fleet was not in the harbor at the time. However, 21 vessels and almost 200 aircraft were destroyed. Just over 2,400 Americans were killed. Almost 1,200 were injured. Very big deal. Um, the next day, December 8th, the U.S. declares war on Japan and officially enters World War II. And because the U.S. had declared war on Japan, their allies, Germany and Italy, declare war on the U.S., so then the U.S. declares war on them, and we're in the thick of it. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor. This is what kind of a lot of people forget. The Japanese attacked a whole pile of places. Their U.S. territories, British territories, Dutch territories, a bunch of big ones I have listed here. I'm not going to go through them all. But if you look at these pretty quick, these places are going to be a big deal later. The fight for the Philippines, huge deal. Guam, huge deal. Wake Island, huge deal. Midway Island, turning point in the war. So these places are strategic places. They weren't bombing just to be mean. These are strategic military targets that were picked for a reason. Underestimation. The idea that the U.S. has almost unlimited manufacturing power is yet to be known to the world. There was some previews of this in World War I, but the world is about to realize why the U.S. is a superpower. So, bomb Japan. Not all of the Japanese government and heads of the military agreed with this. There's a couple of quotes that get thrown around a lot. I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant. That one is a real one. When they get talking about a possible invasion of the mainland United States, true mainland United States, the quote, "There will be a rifle behind every blade of grass." Turns out that one's probably not valid or true. However, it definitely boosts our egos as Americans, as like, Red Dawn us, we dare you. But probably wasn't said. However, it's fun to throw it around. Anyways, what we do know is a lot of Japanese leaders, the ones who didn't agree with bringing the U.S. into the war, pointed specifically to World War I. In 1917, the U.S., well, let's say, in 1916, we basically didn't have an army. We had a very small A utilitarian army. We did not have the standing military that we have today, even close to it. In April 1917, we declare war. A little over a year later, in November of 1918, we had landed 2 million troops in Europe. Went from basically nothing to 2 million troops across the world. Same year, 1917, the U.S. is 50th in the world in artillery production. By the following year, we were producing more artillery than France, Britain, and Germany combined. The American wartime logistical system is unmatched. There has been nothing in the history of the world that we know of. Lindsay Nicole reference there. Shout out if you guys get that. There is nothing in the history of the world that has ever had the logistical or manufacturing power that the United States does. And what is almost more important than that, the war isn't on our continent. We have all of this superpower of manufacturing and logistical prowess, and it's not our factories that are getting bombed. So all of these countries in Europe have less manufacturing power than the US, and they're getting blown up all the frickin' time. Of course they can't make anything. So this right here is how the United States brings the Allies to victory in World War II. Yes, Patton was a great general. Yes, we had fantastic logistics. Yes, we had fantastic allies. However, it is the logistical and manufacturing prowess of the United States that brings not only us to victory in World War II, but also pulls us out of um, the Great Depression. It was not FDR, socialist. Anyways, as of 1941, this is what's going on. So the Axis powers have stayed the same. The Allied powers have expanded. There are the original two, plus the United States and the Soviets, like we talked about. But there's also a whole pile of others. The Civil War in China gets put on pause. Those two sides, the nationalists and the communists, they come together to fight off the Japanese. All of the British Commonwealth countries, India, basically anywhere that has ever had colonial ties with either the Brits, the French, or the U.S. Now are also dragged into the war, along with other European nations who are genuinely being affected by what's going on. Ooh, a tough one to talk about. American concentration camps. U.S., like I just talked about, we like to pretend we're the good guys all the time. Not so much the case. Turns out our government does a bunch of terrible things. Who would have thought? So, the attack on Pearl Harbor causes a bunch of Japanese Americans, Japanese immigrants, to be heavily oppressed by their own government, basically. It starts out fairly small, but the resentment builds. So banks wouldn't serve them, grocers, excuse me, wouldn't serve them. People were, you know, uh, you know, factlessly, baselessly suspected of being spies. Um, People thought that Japanese Americans would remain loyal to the Japanese because that's their ethnic heritage and not their citizenship or whatever the case may be. Um, what doesn't help is off the coast of California, a couple of things happen. A Japanese submarine surfaces near Santa Barbara, and it shells an American oil refinery. Two separate times, Japanese bombers drop ordnance on American soil. Both were unoccupied, heavily forested areas. There were no American casualties. However, the public finds out about this and not happy, and the government is almost not happier. So they put them in these camps called internment camps. Anyone who had Japanese ancestry had to relocate to these places where they were basically under martial law. They were under the eyes of the military. Um, yeah, there is a small group of them who actually volunteered to go fight um, for the U.S. military. Actually, one of the highest decorated units of World War II. It was an all Japanese unit. Anyways, some terminology to know as we move forward. Again, remember, I initially made this for high school students, so it was just terms for them to know the easy way to give them a good grade on a quiz. But we'll go through it here anyways. So we already talked about one theater of World War II. We talked about like East and West uh, fronts for Europe. But for the U.S., there are theaters. So there's the European theater as a whole for the U.S., which is basically the Western Front in Europe. And then there's the Pacific theater, which is fighting in Japan and also the Philippines stuff. Um, we just talked about the fronts. Down at Kraut, slang for a German soldier comes from sauerkraut. Leatherneck is slang for a U.S. Marine, comes from their dress uniforms. Tojo, slang for a Japanese soldier, a riff on Japanese government. POW is a prisoner of war. The Red Army is the Soviet military because communism, red. Führer, in German, Führer just means leader, but in this context, it refers directly to Hitler. And GI is slang for American soldier. Originally, it just means government issue, um, but it evolves into slang for an American soldier at this time. Um, yeah, we'll leave it there. Manufacturing. I talked about this a minute ago, but the idea that the U.S. The entire economy turns to manufacturing for the war cannot be understated. Basically, every factory in the U.S. that could be repurposed was repurposed to produce wartime goods. The automobile industry is probably the most famous one. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, they start producing all kinds of stuff. So trucks, jeeps, tanks, artillery, small arms, bombs, mines, helmets, bridges, all kinds of stuff. And a lot of times you won't see these company names stamped on these things. So initially, like you can see here, this is a close-up of an M1 carbine barrel, and you can see that it is actually stamped General Motors. But the left line there, which would technically be on top if this were right side up, says Inland Manufacturing. So Inland Manufacturing is the firearms, basically, firearms manufacturing division of General Motors. So you'll see a lot of stuff. There are subdivisions of these companies that do the wartime producing. So a lot of times you won't see stuff stamped Ford, even though it's Ford making them, if that makes sense. There is still segregation in the military at this time. It won't actually come until 1948 uh, integration of the military. So just like in World War I, military units are still segregated, and even black units are still commanded by white officers. Um, but it wasn't all like, I should say, there was some optimism among black soldiers. There was a widespread belief that if black soldiers helped defeat Hitler's racism, then racism in the U.S. would falter too. Um, there is more truth to that eventually in the military than there is in civilian life. Anyways, unlike World War One, African American units were widespread, especially in combat. In World War One, very few American black soldiers saw combat comparatively. In World War Two, that is very much not the case. The Tuskegee Airmen are probably one of the most famous black units. They were a squadron of pilots, and they did a bunch of badass stuff. There's a whole pile of books on those. I are on there are a whole pile of books on that unit, um, and I definitely recommend checking them out. Um, Super cool. 1943, U.S. military bases are integrated, so there's not like black and white, you know, chow halls and stuff. But like I said, the military as a whole doesn't integrate until 1948. Um, Other minority groups see frontline service: Mexicans, Native Americans, um, like Japanese soldiers as well. Um, a lot of other less prominent minority groups do not get to see as much frontline service as the ones I just mentioned. But like I said, that will come in the years following World War II. American women, their role, basically, what they did in World War One got they stayed the same. They didn't get any worse. However, in some cases, they actually improved, um, which we didn't see from world roles from like if you look at the role of women in the American Revolution to the Civil War, women were much more involved in the American Revolution than they were in the Civil War. Anyways, the Army officially enlists women. They don't treat them like subcontractors anymore, or employ them like subcontractors anymore. Some women get to even be pilots. In the Army Air Corps, the Air Force does not exist yet. 68,000 women are going to serve as nurses between both the Army and the Navy. Um, and at home, obviously, a great deal of the male population gets drafted, which creates a labor shortage, which is a problem because we have all of this manufacturing to do. And it's women that step up to fill those roles. 4 million women work for the government. They do clerical work. 2.5 million women work in shipyards, aircraft factories, docks, manufacturing jobs, a whole pile of them. And some of the best spies, not just for Americans, but European forces as well, were women. Shocker, I know. Here's another Pet Electrician video. It's fantastic. Goes into this topic of women being spies during World War II. It's very good. Watch it. In Europe, arguably, more involvement was allowed for women in Europe. Um, So they got to be sometimes pilots in the RAF if there were less combat roles. So like if cargo plane pilots. A bunch of women were in the French resistance as partisans. Like I said, spies for Allied governments. But the Soviets are really the one country that put them in as close to frontline combat as possible. Um, they put them in a lot of sniper roles, and that is frontline combat. Um, the vast majority would serve as sniper roles. Almost 2,500 female snipers would be employed by the Soviets. Um, they had a fairly high casualty rate. Um, 500 of them only would survive the war. Um, but there were some very famous ones. Again, there were some fantastic books written on World War II Soviet snipers. Um, Anyways, back to the U.S. Military. The fall of the Philippines. The Philippines falls in 1942. So, like I said, right after, or basically at the same time, if you don't talk about the time zones, um, right after Pearl Harbor is bombed, the Japanese invade the Philippines. And the forces that were there, though they were not plentiful, Um, the American and Filipino soldiers that were there held out astonishingly well, considering how outnumbered they were. They used the terrain to their advantage, um, but basically they started to run out of food and ammo. They started eating their horses. They started eating their mules. That led to diseases, scurvy, drinking bad water led to dysentery. Being out in the mountains, there was malaria. Basically, they had no choice but to surrender. After 3 months of fighting off the Japanese military, um, 78,000 POWs were taken, and they're forced to march what what gets known as the Bataan Death March. It was a 65-mile long march along the Bataan Peninsula. While, keep in mind, all of these guys are sick and starving. And on that march, 10,000 troops died. Um, Again, another link here. The Ghost of Bataan. It's an uplifting portion of what is ultimately a very sad and depressing part I mean, not that World War II is super uplifting, but this is an especially depressing part of it. I also want to throw out there, like, this is the definition of a war crime. I think because of the atomic bombs, the Japanese kind of get off easy compared to the Germans with their war crimes. But honestly, the Japanese did just as bad, if not worse, stuff than the Germans. So I don't feel bad about the atomic bomb. Anyways, um, we need to take the fight to the Germans. And the Germans are in Africa for some reason. Basically, they want to take Egypt because they know that the Brits are using the Suez Canal and the Nile to transport a bunch of supplies to their colonies in Africa and Asia. So they also, at the same time, the Germans also want to take French territory because they want to remove any remnants of French supply lines. Basically, they don't want the French colonial ties to be uh, smuggling stuff to partisans in France. So two big reasons that the Germans want North Africa. July of 42, right about the same time, a little bit after the Philippines, the Americans invade Morocco and Algeria. These are both places that were French territories that are under German occupation. And the Africa Corps are the German military in Africa. They are commanded by Erwin Rommel. His nickname is the Desert Fox, if you've ever heard that. And this is the first place that American forces are engaging German forces. Uh, while the Americans are invading, the British attack from the west because the Americans are on the east, and they trap the Germans in between. Both infantries advance. By May of 43, the Germans are forced to surrender, and North Africa, the largely the fighting in North Africa is over. Still some skirmishes here and there, but largely the fighting in North Africa is over. And on the other side, the Battle of Stalingrad is happening. So we talked about Operation Barbarossa. It's the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler decides, hey, this two-front war thing really sucks, and I need to knock out the Soviets so I can focus on the Western Front. And he's like, the best way to do it, I need to destroy their economy. So as his troops are advancing through Ukraine mostly, and then they do get into Russia proper. And they're burning down, all the fields that they go to, so no crops, but then also oil fields, factories, like I said, anywhere that has crops, that kind of thing. By the time they get to Stalingrad, they understand that if if we, as the Germans, can take Stalingrad, we can starve out the Soviets. It's a major railroad junction. If we can stop those railroad cars supplying the other places in the Soviet Union, we can starve them out. So German troops enter Stalingrad in September, and it is very gritty, close quarters fighting. They have to go block by block to take the city. And they do. What sucks after that for the Germans is now it's no longer September, it's December, it's January. And some Soviet reinforcements have showed up and they've surrounded the city. And the Germans are trapped inside during winter in Russia. So, a few months later, by the time the Germans are forced to surrender in February, of the 250,000 German soldiers that entered the city, only 91,000 survived. And they were all taken to Russian concentration camps, which is known as the Gulag. And of those 91,000, only 5,000 survived the war. So of those 250,000, only 5,000 survived to the end of the war. Again, Russia, because they're an ally, gets a pass for some reason on war crimes. Anyways, um, yeah, well, the Germans stuck in Stalingrad was tough. Obviously, so many of them died of starvation and disease. There's a bunch of primary source documents that do survive the war, and I remember reading them. In one of them, a German soldier described um, they were starving so badly that they boiled and ate their boot leather because that's all they had left. A lot of guys, they were trapping and eating rats, but the rats had disease, which led to more disease and so forth. Strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is going to be the Allies' best friend. The Allies want to disrupt Germany as much as possible, supply lines, things like that. So they're going to hit places like refineries, railroads, munitions depots, all kinds of places. And the RAF has kind of been doing this basically since the beginning of the war. Um, they've been averaging 2,300 tons of explosives on Germany every month. Um, but in 1943, the Allies as a whole kind of step up their game um, and increase that by like 200 times. Uh, Between 43 and 45, the Allies are averaging 53,000 tons of explosives on Germany every month. Um, and lucky for the Allies, not so much for Germany, these cause a bunch of oil shortages, disrupt German supply lines. Um, Germany also doesn't have a lot of natural reserves of certain minerals or metals, which is going to severely mess up their production of small arms and tanks for that matter. Um, so if you're familiar with like the development of the STG and its ammunition, and then the STG 45, this is why it's so hard for them. They don't have the right materials. That's actually why the STG is stamped, because it's a stamped receiver instead of milled, because they don't have enough good steel to take it away from other supply lines to use on this new experimental thing. Anyways, rant over. Um, this bombing destroys so many German aircraft that they're being destroyed faster than Germany can make them. And this, the Luftwaffe, trained their pilots very well, but this allowed the Allies to have total control of the air by the time, basically, the whole war. After the Battle of Britain, the Allies were in control of the air basically the whole time. Another Fat Electrician video linked here, the Mosquito plane. Oft overlooked, but a really cool plane. Has a really cool developmental history. Again, check that out. the invasion of Sicily. So, with North Africa basically taken care of, the next logical spot is Sicily, and then up through Italy. So they invade, the Allies invade July 10th of 43, and it takes only 8 days for the Allies to capture the western half of Sicily. And then American troops are going to head east while British troops attack from the south. Um, by August, the middle of August, I think I have it up. Yeah, it's right here. August 18th, the Germans have entirely evacuated to mainland Italy. The Biscari massacre. I'm going to link a video in the description to that as well. Um, was it a massacre? Was it justified? Let's talk about it in the comments down below, but watch the video first. Even if you know what it is, just like refresh yourself. I find that's always a good thing that I at least try to do most of the time. Anyways, Mussolini, problem guy, shocker, probably didn't know that. So the speedy victory in Sicily, the Italian government is kind of panicking. The king and a bunch of his generals are like, we got to get rid of Mussolini. Uh, he's screwing us here. The allies are right here, and we got to get him out of here. So they arrest him, and the king goes to him and he says, "Listen, the soldiers don't want to fight anymore. They don't want to fight for you, and they don't want to fight the people who are coming here. The rest of us aren't huge Hitler fans, anyways, supposedly. Listen, you're the most hated man in the country. Sorry, dog." So the Italians go to the Allied governments and start negotiating a surrender. This is a huge blow to the Axis powers, and Hitler starts to panic. So he goes to his favorite little minions, the SS, and he gets some of their Fallschirmjäger or paratroopers, and he says, "Listen, you are going to paratroop, or you're going to parachute rather, into Italy, and you're going to break Mussolini out, and then return him to the areas in northern Italy where there's a fairly heavy German presence, and he'll be safe there, and he'll lead the army from there." And they do. The Waffen SS breaks him out of jail, and then he goes to northern Italy to, do what little he can left from up there. And it's known as the Gran Sasso Raid. Also, cool books written about that. Um, check up on it. It's wild. It's something out of a movie. The rest of Italy comes at quite a cost to the Allies, especially the Americans. Um, over the next 5 months, the two towns of Cassino and Anzio get captured. 2 weeks for Rome, which sounds good. Like 2 weeks to take the capital. That sounds not terrible. Um, but despite that, fighting Italy continues for another year, well into 1944. However, as of 43, those parts of the Italian military are starting to switch sides. They're siding with the king. So there are pockets of support for the Allies in Italy by Italians. Um, so there's kind of a rift there. Overall, the campaign through Italy is the bloodiest campaign of the war. There's 300,000 Allied casualties. There's actually more than 300,000 Allied casualties during the Italian campaign. On the other side, the Soviets have been fighting the Germans and pushing west after the German failure of Operation Barbarossa. This fighting on the Eastern Front is some of the most brutal. This is like the last, like if somebody was like, "Hey, we're gonna drop you into World War II, you get to pick the place." Literally, the last place I would pick is the Eastern Front. That was some of the most brutal fighting You can imagine. I implore you to go out and read some primary sources. A lot of these guys were writing letters. Read the letters. They're wild. And this whole time that there's some of the most brutal fighting ever going on, neither side can really feed their troops. So these guys are half-ass starving the whole time. And both sides are progressively getting more and more brutal to their respective POWs. It's bad. I, it's bad. I think probably yeah. I was one of the worst positions to be in probably is a Nazi POW or a Soviet POW, so a German that got taken a prisoner by the Soviets. That or an American captured by the Japanese. Um, ooh, rough both ways. Anyways, another link here. Nicknamed the meth soldier guy accidentally took his whole unit's supply of performance enhancing drugs, and then went on like a 2 week rampage. Fun video. The Tehran Conference happens in late 1943. So Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, they meet in Iran. And they are going to agree, they're going to come to some conclusions about how we're going to fight the rest of this war. So the Soviets are going to launch a full-scale offensive as the Allies invade France. So those two things are going to happen at the same time. After the war, we are going to divide Germany to stop them from threatening world peace again. Regardless of their honestly almost innocence in World War One, it doesn't look that way to the world, especially while we're at war at Germany or with Germany. Again, after the war, once Germany is defeated, the Soviets they pledge aid basically to the U.S. In fighting Japan. At the same time, they also agree to a global peacekeeping organization. So the it's gonna early versions of the UN. There's stuff like that in place already, but clearly, since we're having a world war right now, it's not really working. So we need a new system, so they know they're gonna try to come up with something like that. It eventually turns into the UN. Operation Overlord, D-Day. This is Saving Private Ryan. This is Band of Brothers. That picture is terrible. I'm sorry. Anyways, um, the Germans know the Allies are going to invade France at some point. So he basically makes his own Maginot Line in France on the coast, and it's known as the Atlantic Wall. Um, Dawn, June 6, 1944, 160,000 Allied troops invade Normandy, France. And these are American, Canadian, and British troops largely. I know that there's some others, but those are the largest contingencies. Infantry lands on one of 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juno. And they're supported by ships that were shelling German emplacements. And then there's a whole pile of like 20,000 paratroopers that land behind enemy lines. All beaches are taken fairly quickly and successfully, except for Omaha. Omaha is the beach that Saving Private Ryan shows. Um, this is the one place where they meet extreme resistance. Um, it, they even start planning to evacuate at one point. It's going so poorly. They lose nearly 2,500 men. However, they take the beach by late afternoon. Um, D-Day, Operation Overlord as a whole, is still to this day the largest amphibious operation in human history. The Incheon landing, which we'll talk about when we talk about Korea, huge, still not this huge. Another video I have linked here, James McNasty McNeese, This was the first Fat Electrician video I ever watched. It's a badass video. James McNeese was a badass dude. This arguably one of the most entertaining videos ever, but I'm a giant nerd, so who am I to say? Anyways, here's just a map of the Atlantic Wall. Um, if you look, this is the shortest point between both places, and this is where um, Hitler thought they were going to invade. And actually, if you're familiar with the Ghost Army, the Allies put a bunch of like blow up fake stuff over here, acting like they were going to invade. Uh, in this close point right here, um, just to fake out the Germans. So the Germans actually deployed a whole pile of troops here, and then they landed like over here. Anyways, this is just a map of the Atlantic Wall. Horses. Um, a funny thing that doesn't get talked about, and I think puts things in a in perspective in a cool way. So up to this point, modern history in terms of World War II, the Germans still are using horses for a lot of stuff. Troop transport, supply transport. I mean, they're pulling wagons. They're doing all kinds of stuff. Now, as the American troops enter Germany proper, not, any other place, the Germans, again, primary source documents are very fun to read. There's a lot of translated ones. And there's a bunch of them from German officers being puzzled at the American lack of horses. The Americans don't have any horses. They have all motorized vehicles. Remember what I said about American logistics and manufacturing. The U.S. is manufacturing engines and vehicles while drilling, extracting, and refining enough oil to run them all, and then shipping it all across the world in such quantities that they don't need horses. And the Germans couldn't do that in Germany. So the idea that the idea that the Americans didn't need horses, it was one of the first hints to the German high command that they're screwed. The U.S. is simply operating on a scale that the world has never encountered before. Another cool horse related thing. Another Fat Electrician video, The Last War Chief. Fun video. I don't remember if it's in here or not, so I'm going to talk about it here, and if it comes up again, I'll just skip it. But another really fun primary source document is a letter. What's not a letter? It's like a statement that was given by one of the German high command, some German officer, um, after the war, and the question asked was, "When did you know you were losing the war?" And he said that they had intercepted um, a cake for an American soldier. Um, so that this cake had been baked in the United States, and then the United States shipped it again across the world, and then through several countries to the front lines of a war to some random soldier, not some high ranking dude, some random friggin' guy before the cake went bad. That's when he knew that they were logistically outgunned. That's when he knew that they were going to lose, which I just think is a funny little anecdote. Anyways, Battle of the Bulge. This is in Band of Brothers. Fantastic scene or episode rather. So this is basically the Nazis' last ditch of offense. Um, and initially it goes well for them. They catch the American forces off guard and surround them. Now, within a couple days, American reinforcements show up and they begin messing up the Germans real bad. And the Air Force starts bombing fuel depots, and this goes on for like weeks. Eventually, the Americans come out victorious. They deliver a whole pile of losses to the Germans, like it's like 100,000 casualties, and they lose however many mechanized the trucks, tanks, aircraft, things like that. Um, Also, it's called the Battle of the Bulge for the shape that the surrounded guys made. Uh, if you looked at it on a map, they made like a little bulge. I'll find a map. Anyways, um, the Germans, I mean, this was their last swing, and they friggin' missed. So there wasn't much left that the Germans had to prevent the Allies from getting into Germany. A lot like Midway for Japan, this makes it so the Germans are on a defensive for the rest of the war, basically regardless of what happens. Another video linked. It's a cool one. I know, broken record. Just he makes cool videos. I'm sorry. Ending the war in Europe. So the British and American forces, they're liberating France. The Soviets are launching an offensive to push back the Germans. This is what we talked about with the Tehran Conference. By the time the Americans win the Battle of the Bulge, the Soviets have pushed the Germans not only just out of the Soviet Union, but all the way back across Poland, and they are also at the German border. So, very close to the same time, American troops enter Germany from the west, Soviet troops enter from the east. They sandwich what is left of the German military in between. April 30th, this is the official story. 10 days after his birthday, Hitler takes a cyanide pill and shoots himself because the cyanide pill didn't work while in his underground bunker. Week later, May 7th, Germany surrenders to the Allies. The next day is known as VE Day for Victory in Europe. What I normally show here, again, another link, not a Fat Electrician video, I know, shocked, is the concentration camp liberation scene from Band of Brothers. Um, Again, lost in translation or lost in context. While all of the fighting was going on, the Americans, especially regular troops, didn't know about the concentration camps. So the surprise and the confusion that goes on when the Americans find one and they're trying to figure out what it is and who all these people are, it's accurate and it's very well shown in Band of Brothers. So the fighting in the Pacific has been going on. We touched on it earlier, but now the U.S. is using Australia as its main base of operations. Basically, because we need to get closer to the Philippines and Japan. And turns out, actually, Australia is not even good enough. It's not even close enough. So we need to capture New Guinea. And then we're going to use New Guinea as a base of operations to launch an even bigger operation to take the Philippines. So it gets this idea, this plan gets called island hopping. And they're going to get closer and closer, island by island, to mainland Japan, while they're readying themselves for a full-scale invasion. At this time, the atom bomb doesn't exist, and the plan is, once we get there, yeah, I mean, we're gonna fight on mainland Japan, and the Soviets are gonna help us. Why are we doing this? Basically, if again, the plan is to invade the main island of Japan, and if we can have that invasion while Japan is also surrounded by U.S. air and naval bases, it'll make it much easier. And if we don't take those islands and then put air and naval bases on them, those are going to be used against the U.S. occupying force. It would turn into, you know, a quasi-insurgency. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to use the same amphibious assault tactic that we did on D-Day. We're just going to do it on little tiny islands instead. So one uh, particular anecdote that I thoroughly enjoy. One island in particular, the Tarawa Atoll. Um, I forget the Japanese general's name, but he says, "Listen, you can't take this island with 1 million men in 100 years." And then the U.S. Marines showed up with 4,000 guys and took it in 3 days. I love that. The Battle of Midway. I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago. Happens between June 4th and June 7th. Again, depending on the source, which and what source uses what time zone, it's very annoying. Anyways, uh, early June 1942. It's a major naval battle between the U.S. and Japan, and we're like 6 months ish after Pearl Harbor. The U.S. breaks the Japanese transmission encryptions, and now we can plan an ambush. We can listen in on them. The U.S. sinks 4 aircraft carriers. The names are listed there. And loses the USS Yorktown in the process. But you got to understand the U.S. has magnitudes more ships than the Japanese does. So them losing 4 and us losing 1 is, detrimental for them and kind of not a big deal for us. I'm not trying to downplay the lives that were lost. I just mean on a greater scale, it didn't change the war any for us. And it cripples the Japanese Navy. It permanently shifts the tide in favor of the U.S. Like I said, after this, the Japanese are largely going to be on the defensive for the remainder of the war. And this is what most people say is the most important or most decisive battle in the Pacific theater during the war. So we're going to bring the fighting to the Philippines. The U.S. troops spend 2 years capturing islands around the Philippines to do this invasion, the same way we were talking about we were going to do with mainland Japan. Some famous ones, Morotai, Guadalcanal. But by October 20th of 44, American forces have seized, or excuse me, an American force the size of the invasion force of Normandy has landed on the Philippines, and we're going to begin taking it back. It's during this operation that the Battle of Leyte Gulf, excuse me, the largest naval battle in history occurs. So these things are happening at the same time concurrently. And it's during this battle that the Japanese first use kamikaze attacks. If you don't know what those are, they're like suicide bombers, but in a plane. They're deliberately flying their planes into targets, killing themselves, but in theory doing large damage to the target at the same time. Fighting in the Philippines doesn't end until the news of Japan's surrender. There were a non-trivial amount of Japanese soldiers who held out in the mountains of Manila, kind of the same way that the defensive Allied force did. And they don't give up until their emperor orders them to. The conflict in the Philippines as a whole left 80,000 Japanese dead and 100,000 Filipino civilians. Iwo Jima in 44. Bombs are falling on Tokyo for the first time as of November 24th. The problem is the bombers keep missing their targets. And this is largely because they don't have enough fuel to correct for any navigational errors that happen. And instrumentation isn't what it is today. So basically, every flight has some navigational errors. So we're too far away. We need something closer to Japan. We need Iwo Jima. Invading Iwo Jima, it's going to be tough. It's defended by a whole pile of concrete bunkers. There's miles of underground tunnels. It's going to be wild. But like Taro Atoll, flamethrowers, explosives, and Marines tend to do the job. 60,000 Marines take Iwo Jima in 36 days, and this is where we get that famous photo of the raising of the American flag tied to a pipe there. Bombing Japan. So now we have Iwo Jima. We can correct for our navigational errors. Now we can drop whole piles of friggin' bombs all over Japan if we want to. And the bomb of choice is napalm. So people, we'll get there in a minute when we talk about the atom bomb. But people ask a lot, well, why not bomb Tokyo? Because Tokyo has been bombed probably more than any other city during the war. I mean, Tokyo, 250,000 buildings were destroyed in Tokyo. 80,000 people were killed in Tokyo. At one point, there was so much fire caused by these napalm explosives, it sucked the oxygen out of the air, and that's what suffocated several thousand Japanese civilians. In total, 67 Japanese cities would be bombed by the Allies, um, but Tokyo was definitely the main target. Okinawa, a little less than a year later, um, Allies come to the conclusion that Japan will not surrender, and we are in fact going to have to take the main island. So we need to set up a base to stockpile supplies for this large-scale invasion. We need to get even closer than Iwo Jima. We need Okinawa. So the U.S. shows up, and the beaches are defenseless, which throws off a lot of the GIs that were there because there's no resistance as they land. However, it turns out they've taken up positions deep in the mountains, which means all of the fighting for the U.S. is uphill, literally. They're under constant machine gun fire. This is some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific Theater. But within a little over 3 months and 12,000 casualties, the U.S. does take the island of Okinawa. On a lighter note, ice cream. This is a really cool thing that I don't think a lot of people know about. And another huge logistical flex for the U.S. So during Prohibition, ice cream and to a lesser extent soda fills the social void that alcohol left because now we can't get alcohol, and we're still gonna get together and socialize and things like that. So a lot of these bars, the ones that don't turn into speakeasies, turn into soda shops or ice cream parlors. And this becomes the norm and yields an entire generation that is obsessed with ice cream. If you ever wonder why your grandparents always seem to have ice cream, this is why. Um, and in an attempt to boost morale and show off, basically, the U.S. converts two concrete barges into ice cream ships. There are two ships in the U.S. fleet whose only purpose is to serve ice cream. The Japanese are starving to death in the mountains of their surviving islands, and the Americans have fresh ice cream in some of the worst environments in the world. And I know you're shocked to find this out, but the Fat Electrician actually has video on that. I alluded to it a couple times. The most powerful weapon in human history, the atom bomb. So the British have actually been toying with this. Basically, everybody knew it was possible. It was just a matter of how exactly to do it. Kind of like the idea of smokeless powder. Everybody knew it was possible. We just had to get the recipe right. Um, the U.S. program to develop a nuclear bomb starts in 41. It's called the Manhattan Project. I'm sure a lot of you at this point have seen Oppenheimer. Um, Fairly, I mean, it's a pretty historically accurate movie. I mean, there's some Hollywoodization, like anything, but pretty good. Um, Aided by a bunch of notable scholars, Albert Einstein, a bunch of captured Nazi scientists, Google Operation Paperclip. July 16th, 1945, American scientists detonate the world's first atomic bomb in New Mexico at a testing site. Debates immediately on its morality. The debate. What are people talking about? So, a full-scale invasion of Japan would cause massive American casualties. Sarah Payne, who is the professor of history at the Naval War College, um, her her estimates were in the millions. It would have cost millions of American lives. Um, Also, it would have saved a lot of Japanese lives, which sounds a little backwards, but you got to understand so so much of Japan was war ravaged. So much of the places that Japan was occupying was war ravaged. A lot of those people were starving. And if we can end the war, we can get those civilians aid and food and supplies. But if we keep the war going, the Allies can't get to them. So if we can end the war really fast with an atom bomb, we can actually save the lives of a lot of Japanese, a lot of Chinese, a lot of Koreans. So this debate gets ended within the American government by Harry Truman. And he said that it was his duty to use every weapon possible to save American lives. Um, the idea, there's also debates on, the Russians were about to invade, the Russians were in Manchuria. Would this have, it would have caused more Russian loss of life if we didn't do this? There's a whole pile of reasons. Let me know what you think in the comments. I used to have my students. This used to be an essay topic. I used to have them write one way or another, and then defend their answer. So if you feel like doing that, pop it in the comments. Ending the war in the Pacific. The Allies go to Japan and say, "Listen, we will give you a quote, prompt and utter destruction if you do not surrender." And Japan obviously didn't know about the atom bomb at the time, so they ignore the message. They don't even send a response. So August 6th of 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay drops the first atomic bomb ever used in combat. It's nicknamed the Little Boy, and they drop it on the city of Hiroshima. 120,000 people died, and thousands more died later of burns. I have radiation sickness written down, but actually, in fairly recently, there's been some uh, debate about how that works. Not specifically in Japan, um, because it's a airburst is different, but maybe I'll just do a separate vignette about how radiation spreads on whether an impact explosion or an airburst explosion and how it affects things like this or Chernobyl or things like that. So maybe I'll just cut that here and I'll do another video. Let me know if you want to hear about that in the comments. Anyways, the Allies go to the Japanese again and say, "Listen, surrender, or we're going to do it again." Um, no, basically, again, no answer. A couple days later, August 9th, complying with the agreements made at the Tehran conference, the Soviets declare war on Japan. Like I said, they're in Manchuria. They're very close. They can start island hopping now, basically. Later that same day, the U.S. drops a second atomic bomb, codenamed the Fat Man, on the city of Nagasaki. It's Japan's largest port. This time, 74,000 people die. Um, and between the the idea of getting bombed like that again, and also the the knowledge of the Soviets entering the war and now Japan possibly having a two-front war, the emperor orders his government to surrender. Surrender comes on August 15th, 1945. This is known as VJ Day for victory in Japan. And the war is finally over. Before we move on, I do want to talk about why the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, why not Tokyo? And like we said before, because Tokyo has been bombed more than any other city in the entire war. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were specifically chosen because they had not been bombed. And the whole point of the atom bomb was to show how destructive it is. And uh, that that show that is not quite as impressive, not quite as scary if you drop it on a city that's already basically all rubble. So that's why those cities were chosen. Putting the enemy on trial. There's actually a movie coming out about this, about the Nuremberg trials with Russell Crowe. I hope it's historically accurate. The way Hollywood's been going recently, it probably won't be. Um, Oppenheimer excused. Anyways, they put together the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, to try the Axis powers for their war crimes. There is a large-scale prosecution of Nazi officials, and like I said, Nuremberg, Germany, um, which is where the Nazis held their rallies, which is kind of supposed to be some like cosmic justice. 3 Nazis were acquitted, 114 were sent to prison, and 36 were given death sentences. Again, I know there is more nuance to it than that. Things changed after that. A lot of them were uh, commuted sentences. Anyways, for Japan, they get off uh, way easier. 25 of their leaders were tried for war crimes. 18 were sent to prison. 7 were sentenced to death. I have Unit 731 written down here because I think the Japanese got off easy. Blown away, blown away. If if China didn't fall to communism in 1949 and we didn't strategically need a friend in Asia during the Cold War, and then we forced Japan to be that friend, I don't think Japan would have the legacy it does today. Um, Unit 731 was terrible. The reason we know that the human body is 80% water or whatever it is because the Unit 731 weighed people and then put them alive in giant ovens and then turned them into like people jerky and then weighed them again afterwards. They did all kinds of disgusting, gross human experiments. They made Dr. Mengele, the angel of death, they made him look like well, an angel. They made him look like a saint. It's disgusting. Wendigoon has a great video on Unit 731. I implore you, please go watch that. I won't go on too much of a rant, but ridiculous. Anyways, the emperor does not get put on trial, basically because they thought if the emperor was put on trial, there would be a civilian Japanese uprising, and that's the last thing we need. So he was not put on trial. Creating the UN. We want, that international political organization basically to prevent another world war. So it's kind of like a more advanced League of Nations. Every member gets a vote. We got to vote on all kinds of stuff. And there's also the UN, the United Nations, is to have this Security Council, the UNSC, with 11 members. 5 of those members are permanent. Excuse me. And they are the Allied powers in World War II. So Britain, France, the U.S., the Soviets, and China, which is to be of some problems later. Anyways, it's they're permanent members because they led the largest fights against the Axis. Not that other countries didn't. Oh, the Commonwealth, a whole bunch of countries did, but these five um, put the most into it. Let's say that. And each of these members have veto power in the UN, which will come to bite us in the ass. Wait till we get to the Cold War. The General Assembly votes on resolutions, they vote on budgets, things like that. And the Security Council is basically responsible for security. They're like the police of the world. Um, in theory, they investigate international problems. They would go and propose settlements. Uh, in theory, this all sounds nice. In practice, this kind of thing rarely happens the way it does on paper, and that's shocking. But in 1948, um, they issue this thing called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's 30 rights that are said to be universally applicable to people in all societies. I implore you to go look that up and let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you think even some of the founding members are holding themselves to that. Anyways, that's kind of the end. This is it. After this, actually, technically before this, the Cold War starts, and we'll get into that. But this is the end of World War II. This is the beginning of the Cold War, which is my favorite period in American history. I cannot wait to get to that. I'm very excited. Um, if you have any questions about anything, put them in the comments below. If there's anything you want me to cover, either that this video went, glossed over and didn't do enough of, or something we can do in the future, let me know what you guys want to hear. And if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Thanks for coming out. Do the liking and the subscribing and the sharing. It does help. I want to grow this channel. Well, like I said, work has been very busy. I'm doing my best to keep stuff coming out for you. Um, but I appreciate you guys coming out, spending some time with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.